Welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. I'm Caley Fretz, slightly different accent than what you might be used to. That's because we are flipping the format of the show a little bit today. I am in the host chair, and Ronan Mc Laughlin is our expert guest. Usually, Ronan, you're doing the question asking. Today, you're going to be doing the question answering.
That's because I've been asking a lot of questions for a long time on a specific series I've been working on. So I'm maybe not an expert yet, but I'm well versed right now on the topic we're about to discuss.
I feel like you're an expert. So today we are talking about marginal gains, and specifically the dark side of marginal gains, and I guess the downsides of chasing marginal gains, and the negative externalities, one might say, of chasing some of these things down. We have all seen them. We've seen those claims that promise a new wheel set or a frame, or just this week, some shoes that will save you 7 watts or 32 seconds or whatever the number is. But are those numbers actually real? And even if they are, do they matter to you as a cyclist in the real world? Today we're going to unpack the testing, the spin, and what actually helps you ride faster in the real world and what doesn't. So, Ronan, I'm going to start with the real basics here. Marginal gains is a term that we hear all the time, largely, I think, associated early on with Team Sky and Dave Brailsford and that whole operation. But what exactly are they? Like, what are we talking about here, really?
Yeah, it's effectively like a performance philosophy or a performance mindset where you focus on stacking small, genuine advantages on top of each other, the aggregation of them that then leads to a major performance benefit, or a performance benefit that is much greater than the sum of its parts.
And it's kind of come to underpin, I guess, sort of the modern philosophy of optimization and racing, right? And performance.
It's kind of the sort of the starting point for everything that professional bike racing has turned into today. All the aerodynamic gains, even the nutrition gains, all the training gains, all the optimization, as you said, all that sort of starts with small tweaks, small refinements, changes in strategy, and all these optimizations combined to have a major impact on our performance. And as you said, started with Team Sky and has sort of been adopted by every team, every brand, every individual in performance cycling these days.
At least the ones that are winning.
Yes. And I think what I wanted to sort of unpack in the written series that sort of accompanies this article is where that sort of went wrong and how that performance philosophy paved the way for today's marketing landscape filled with like dubious claims and unintended consequences, and all the while these marginal gains are actually, the returns from them are diminishing all the time.
Yeah, I feel like we're a long way from the heady days of laterally stiff and vertically compliant, which used to be the sort of the old marketing jargon, right? And now it's gotten a lot more specific. It's like, ooh, it is laterally X, Y, Z. It is vertically this. It is aero this. It is more efficient this. And we see these numbers attached to all these things. When did you feel like that shift happened? Like, when did you start to feel like things were going sideways with the kind of marginal gains movement, if you could call it that?
I think it's hard to pinpoint a moment. I think in hindsight, it actually probably went wrong when Team Sky started singing and dancing about this stuff. You know, if it was as truly transformative as we are led to believe it was, theoretically at least, they should have been keeping that advantage top secret and keeping it to themselves. So maybe it went wrong at the very start. But I think more recently, just the never ending role of every single new product that gets announced has to come with some sort of claim of Y watts saved or X seconds saved or this much faster. Sometimes that is, well founded. Sometimes that is unavoidable if we're talking about time trial equipment. You're not really going to buy that for any reason other than if it is going to make you faster. But other times it's just the way we do things now, which is the exact opposite of what marginal gains are supposed to be. They're supposed to look into how we've always done things and see if there's a different way to do them. At least that was one aspect of it. And now it's, It doesn't matter if if the new frame coming to market, a new set of shoes coming to market, a new head unit, or, even going onto our own Instagram feeds and getting bombarded with all these different supplements and lung resistance training, and the list is just absolutely endless. And at some point recently, I think what will come as a shock to some people is that at some point recently, I flipped somewhere inside. I was like, I can't take it anymore. It's too much. It's everywhere. It's infuriating, and it needs to stop.
Well, you've just joined me. You've joined me in well, me, our good friend Zach Edwards. He has often said, if everybody has an Arrow helmet, nobody has an Arrow helmet, like that kind of perspective. So I guess the follow-up question there is, are we actually chasing gains anymore? Or are we just afraid of missing out on gains, right? Like, are we just like trying to get back up to baseline? And the baseline is now such that you've got to have the Arrow socks and you've got to have the everything to just be at baseline with everybody else.
The baseline has shifted, that's without doubt. The fear of missing out is very, very real. I will field questions literally on a daily basis from riders who will ask, is this new helmet, or is this new skin suit, or are these aerobot cages, or is X, Y, and Z going to make me faster? And it's not really a question of it going to make me faster. You can see what the underlying question is. The underlying question is, how do I get this thing? Because I can't compete without it. And it's that sort of mentality, the fear of missing out, that the marginal gains marketing, so to speak, sort of has led to. And I think that is quite dangerous because, to contradict myself, marginal gains are still very, very real. The original concept of aggregating these marginal gains to make yourself faster does work. If we take this simple example of all the equipment that Sean Kelly rode with in 1988, a round frame with 32 spoke wheels, 19 mil tires, woolly jersey, all those things, and you compare it to anything that you can buy off the shelf today, today's equivalent will be much, much faster. You will go much faster with the modern setup, even though at each step of the way we could have picked holes or picked flaws with every little marginal gain along the way. And so, that's where we're sort of missing the point, where when we buy the Arrow marketing or the marginal gains claims and try to whittle down something to a single claim of this is 7 seconds faster over 40 kilometers, we miss the point in that it shouldn't be about which is faster, which is slower. If we're Arrow testing something, it should be about understanding what is it that's slowing us down and how do we improve that. If you talk to the likes of Dan Bigham, they're very rarely are they like testing A versus B. They may be doing A/B testing, but they don't want to know is like A or B faster. They want to understand the physics behind it, and in understanding those physics, you can then further develop the entire system to be much, much faster for a much bigger than a marginal gain. So I think to go all in on marginal gains still has its place, but I think to be you or Zach is also wrong.
I'm still sticking with Zach.
It's everything in moderation sort of, is maybe the best way to think about it. And that if that sort of gets to what the focus of the entire written series was about. And that's like, if the marginal gains become the focus, what suffers are the fundamentals. The fundamentals are proper training, proper nutrition, proper recovery. Those are the things that will, they're not sexy. You're not going to see a massive result overnight, but it's the neglect of those fundamentals that marginal gains becomes a real problem. And actually, as I sort of figured out in writing this article, actually marginal gains sometimes lead us to neglecting the fundamentals.
Explain that a little bit more. Like, how does that happen?
There's a concept known as licensing, and it typically refers to sort of the tendency to justify poor choices by pointing to past good ones. And I think in cycling that sort of manifests as riders neglecting the fundamentals because they believe, probably somewhat subconsciously, that the latest marginal gain gives you an edge anyway. And perhaps the simplest way to think about that is like, oh, I can have this pizza instead of a healthy meal because I've got this green powder shake that I drank this morning that's making up for whatever poor nutritional choices I might make throughout the day. And, don't get me wrong, we're all entitled to the odd pizza, the odd beer, no problem, especially when we've earned it after a hard day on the bike. But, that's just a simple example of how licensing can manifest.
Can I provide a worse example? And by worse, I mean like worse for you and the sport. It's similar to what a lot of riders have said, and I'm thinking specifically of, I believe it was delved into in Tyler Hamilton's book, if I remember correctly, of the doping era of cycling. It was essentially that exact circumstance, that sort of licensing circumstance, where riders felt because they had access to means of raising their hematocrit to 59.9, that they could then therefore neglect some other things, right? They were not eating as well as riders currently do. They left all kinds of stuff sort of on the table, and that is exactly the same concept, which is like, oh, I have this thing that's going to make me fast anyway, so I can neglect the essentials. And it's just sort of a fundamental psychological reality. And I think most listeners out there probably be like, I would never do that, but I think we all do to some extent. Like, you do the math in your head. The training is hard. It's raining outside. I don't want to go do it. I've got Aero shoe covers. We're going to be fine. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying.
Maybe the training analogy is like, oh, it's not a nice day to go out, or I don't feel like training to the plan today, which again is fine, but please don't take these examples as like black and white examples or hard and fast examples. You've got a set training session on the plan and you don't particularly enjoy that one. You don't really want to do it today. You're not all that motivated. So you say, oh, I'm going to hop on the trainer. I'll do this 30-minute high intensity exercise session instead, because some research paper recently has said that has X amount of boost in VO2 max or whatever. And it's, those sorts of decisions actually, it's picking the easier option, which is fine sometimes, but sometimes we just need to do the harder, more difficult thing. And I think all too often marginal gains give us that out that does come at the expense of the fundamentals. And I think the example I always give is like when I was riding full time, I did slip into a hole one time of, I think I was at home for like a training camp for a month or something. It was over the summer. And, with the idea that, your watts per kilo and all that and your weight are so important. How am I going to lose some weight in that? And I got into this vicious cycle where I would try to lie on as long as I could in the morning, get up, I would have a decent breakfast. But then I would ride for 6 hours and I would time that so that I would be out all day. I wouldn't leave the house until like 11 or 12 noon, wouldn't be home until 6 or 7 p.m. I would then have a dinner and then I'd go to bed. So it was effectively skipping a meal. And then that got worse because as that per choice sort of caught up in my body and my body started demanding more calories and more sugar and more carbohydrates, I developed an addiction to Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And it started off as,
who amongst us has not suffered this fate?
Who has not? But wait till you hear. It started off as a few spoons like you would normally have. That went on to half a tub. That went on to a full tub of Ben and Jerry's ice cream per day. And that's a
real financial outlay as well.
That is, especially when you're a full-time cyclist. But what's more troublesome about it is that, as the guilt sort of set in about eating a full tub of Ben and Jerry's, what actually started to pay, instead of like spotting the problem here that I was skipping an entire meal in a day while exerting a heck of a lot more energy and burning calories in that while I was out on the bike, and recognizing that I actually just needed to feed myself properly. What I did was I swapped the main parts of dinner for just more lettuce, more cucumber, more nothing. It was just this vicious circle. And, lo and behold, I lost like 5 kilos in 4 weeks. And I went to a stages in France and performed pretty well for about 3 days. And then I was stuck to the road for the rest of the season. In hindsight, there was a lot of licensing going on there, both in the training and the nutrition.
I want to talk a little bit about specifics here. So we want to talk about when marginal gains go wrong. Licensing is a perfect example, but there's most of the marginal gains we're talking about and that you talk about on this podcast are equipment based, or a lot of them, maybe not most, but a lot of them are equipment based. And there are genuine trade-offs and problems with chasing marginal gains to no end with your equipment, right? You've got sort of fit and adjustability problems and positional problems. Can you provide some examples for me there of stuff you've seen where that's gone wrong?
Well, I think before we can delve into that, we have to sort of explain some sort of the catch-22 position that we found ourselves in that the more that X watts saved and Y seconds saved become the metric by which we buy and sell performance, then the more brands have to go then and chase that, and manufacturers have to chase that. And so while, developing a new aero bike, you would expect it to be faster. It now also has to be a certain amount faster than the previous generation. It also has to be lighter than the previous generation. And if it's not, we're probably not going to buy it, us as consumers. So the brands have to find a way to continually getting faster and faster and faster, lighter and lighter and lighter. And the example you just give there of like positional adjustability, and that one of the main trends that we've seen of late is this move towards integrated handlebars and stems. And those probably are lighter in most cases at this point, probably also stiffer. But what they also will do is like they will test faster in a wind tunnel. The problem with that is that we don't ride in wind tunnels. We ride in the outdoors.
Are bikes being designed for wind tunnels or people these days?
There's probably a certain element of that going on. And I don't know if they're designed for wind tunnels, but they're certainly the designing for the person has been sacrificed a little of late, and probably more specifically designing to the demands of the person rather than, when I say that, I mean like the marketing demands that like it has to be more aero, it has to be lighter,
right?
Developed towards those demands of the individual rather than the unique individual demands of the rider. And the reason that's so important is because that regardless of how aero you make a bike, the rider is still going to account for at least 80% of the total drag of the system. In fact, the more aero you make the bike, the bigger percentage of the drag that the rider is contributing towards. If one of those ways that you've found to make the bike more aerodynamic actively makes the rider less aerodynamic, which an integrated handlebar and stem could do, because you just can't adjust it easily. You can't tweak your position. You can't adjust your position. You can't test different positions. Then that could, what might be like a 2 watt saving in the wind tunnel or CFD or whatever, could actually end up being a significantly bigger loss in the real world, because the rider has to sit more upright, or because the rider can't get into their most aerodynamic position. And, if you're buying these things because you think they look aesthetically pleasing, then, have at it. But if you're being led down this path because you think you're buying performance, that's, I think, where the issue lies. It's like these things, I would almost, I think the best way to put it is like the integrated handlebar and stem. Yeah, we'll stick with that example. The integrated handlebar and stem may well.
It's the most egregious. Yeah. It's the most egregious example. Like, because it's annoying on a number of fronts. This is the issue.
But it might well test faster side by side in a wind tunnel with a 2-piece setup. But the 2-piece setup has such a higher ceiling in terms of what you can get in your own aerodynamics. The 2-piece setup is probably, in most scenarios, going to work out far faster for the individual.
Interesting. And I think that this sort of correlation or connection between the pro side of the sport and the amateur side of the sport is probably somewhat contributing to that as well. I mean, if you walk around the paddock at your average professional bike race, these days you do see a lot of 1-piece bar stem combo things, right? But all those riders have also gone through a pretty extensive fit process. They've probably tried lots of things. And there is something, you do still see lots of 2-piece bars and stems, right? Because there are a certain portion of the riders on any professional team who cannot get the fastest fit on that 1-piece bar and stem. And granted, they've done velodrome testing or wind tunnel testing or whatever else to make sure that they can, to optimize that. The average end consumer is not doing all of those things. It's not doing all of that testing, and it's just whacking a 1-piece bar and stem on and thinking they're going faster.
What else you see is integrated handlebars and stems that are not available to the end consumer. So you might you might buy a 56 size large off the shelf aero bike that comes only with a 100 mil stem with 40 centimeter wide handlebars, and then you turn up to the pro race and Matthew van der Poel or Wout van Aert or whoever else, so you could pick any example from any team riding any manufacturer's bike, will have a combination of stem length and handlebar width that doesn't exist for the individual paying consumer. And that's sort of where I think the manufacturers do have to sort of, take on some of the responsibility here. They maybe have to take on a lot, but that's where I think they are looking to have their cake and eat it, where we are told these things make us this amount faster. They save us this amount of time. We aren't told that those savings are only accessible if you fully optimize the system, if you fit the system properly, if it works for you effectively. And so it's like they want to reduce SKUs, they want to reduce options, they want to streamline the sales process and use the aero claims to sell bikes, and aren't really fully forthcoming on how accessible and how representative those aero claims are of the aero savings you might actually find on the road.
Well, and they just don't even provide a whole bunch of sizes of those bars and stems. Almost every time I get one of those bikes into test, it doesn't actually fit me properly. And generally, if I go and ask the brand in question to send me the thing that would make it fit properly, it doesn't exist, right?
That gets to like one of the promises we made when we set up Escape Collective was that we were going to have our aero testing leaderboard. One of the reasons that perhaps the main and only reason that hasn't happened is because it's actually kind of impossible to compare bikes. Like I got bikes in for the purposes of doing that aero testing, and you know what is the fairest way to do that? Should I, if I do have access to different lengths, bars and stems that the average consumer doesn't, should I then get those in, spend an entire day swapping each of them on each bike and then test it in my optimized position? Or should I test it in the forced position that buying the bike I would have forced upon me, unless I'm going to spend another $700 on the optional bar and stem. And you know, that's where, that comparison just was not possible in the end, up because of all the limitations that we put on the rider positioning when we put ourselves on top of these aero bikes.
How do you think, let's put yourself in the shoes of a bike brand right now. And let's sort of play devil's advocate here, because I do think that there's sort of blame on both sides. There's blame on the consumer side, and there's blame on the bike brand side. You could sort of argue that like maybe the marketing has helped drive the consumer demand, but at the same time, I would equally say that like, you know, media like us and folks talking about all these things all the time has probably done as much to drive consumer demand as the actual bike brand marketing. So we're also complicit in this, or have some blame in this. But if you put yourselves in the shoes of a bike brand, how are you reconciling sort of genuine engineering and, you know, need to fit all these different types of riders and sizes of riders and whatever else with the sales pressure that is the reality? Because there's lots of people out there who just want something that has a nice low number in a wind tunnel test, regardless of the sort of validity of that wind tunnel test. How would you deal with that?
I mean, Dan Bigham spoke about this when he was on this podcast last year, and he said like he would, in his ideal world, he develops products that he thinks stand on their own merits. They sell because they do allow a rider to get faster. But he understood like the pressures that bigger manufacturers face when, you know, ultimately you have to be able to sell these things on the question that the riders are asking. And that is, does this make me faster or does this make me slower? And it kind of comes back to, again, that we already discussed, is like trying to have a faster or slower answer. It's sort of the wrong approach with all this. And it also gets to the question, like I would ask back to you, and that is if a brand came out and didn't make any aero claims, what would happen in that scenario? It would probably get ridiculed also. But they make these aero claims and they get ridiculed for making them. And so like the only real out I see at this point for everybody is one that the manufacturers have actually created, once again, with reducing SKUs, with integrated handlebars, with all the other pressures that have come on of late. And that is by introducing something I've sort of coined as usable aero. And so by going back to a two-piece adjustable handlebar, a brand could say, look, this isn't quite as fast in a wind tunnel, but actually the ceiling is much higher. The opportunities are much greater. Buy this two-piece setup and you will be this amount faster, which is probably actually in some ways, you know, there's going to be more truth to that than the status quo at the moment.
But it's a matter of shifting that narrative, which is a hard thing to do, because people want to buy. You know, what's the old don't buy upgrades, ride upgrades. No one wants to do that. I would much prefer to buy upgrades than ride upgrades. Well, you get what I mean. Ideally, you're doing both. But that is a narrative that has to shift, right?
that gets us back to our earlier conversation about, neglecting the fundamentals and marginal gains still having their place. Each of us have our own physiological capabilities. We can, whether that's the athletic ability we're born with or born without, or it's the time constraints that our everyday lives force upon us mean that we can't train as much as we would like. Either way, we're limited because we're not professional riders. And so at some point we will have maximized the fundamentals. At that point, we can start applying these marginal gains. And, there are probably safer bets and directions to take. And that's probably the way we should be trying to look at this, rather than everything having to make us faster all the time.
Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process, along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.